Ever wonder who's in charge of what in a country? What do the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary really do? And why is it such a big deal to keep these powers separate? In today's episode, we are diving into something very interesting called the separation of powers and why it's so important in keeping our democracies in check. Let's get started. Alright, so what's this separation of powers all about? It's basically a fancy way of saying we don't want one branch of government hogging all the control in a country. In a nutshell, we split the power of the state into three elements: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And each one of these branches has its own powers without stepping on the toes of the other. This setup basically stops one branch from getting too much control and keeps them watching over each other to ensure that they don't abuse their powers. Okay, let's break this down. First, we have the legislature. They are the people who make the laws in a country, often called the parliament, assembly, or congress. Usually in democratic countries, we vote these people into power. But not all parliamentary bodies are elected. For example, the House of Lords in England, which is the second house of parliament, is not an elected house. Next, we have the executive. They are the ones who put those laws that are passed by the legislature into action and make up policies. Presidents, prime ministers, government ministers are all part of the executive. And last but definitely not least, we have the judiciary. And these include the judges and the court systems of a country. Their primary job is to resolve disputes and interpret the law that has been passed by Parliament. Now, while their job isn't to make law, in some instances they do end up making law when they interpret the law, because this includes filling the gaps in the legislation, which is in some ways making new laws. So where does this separation of powers come into play? The ancient Greeks, like Aristotle, spoke about this when they spoke about dividing the responsibilities of the state to the deliberative, the official, and the judicial. But it was Montesquieu in 1748 that popularized this idea in his book titled The Spirit of the Laws. He believed that this idea of separation of powers was essential to stop tyranny and to keep our freedoms alive. He believed that if one person were to be in charge of making the laws, enforcing the laws, and adjudicating upon the laws, we would be in a lot of trouble. I get that it's a bit dramatic to say that there would be an end to everything, but it gets his message across quite well. If all these powers were vested in one person, we would basically be left with a dictatorship. So his ideas of separation of powers has really shaped the idea of modern democracies, and it has become a must-have in most modern democratic constitutions. Separation of powers is important because it ensures that no single branch of government will have too much control. And in turn, it will prevent abuse of power and protect individual rights and liberties. So the legislative arm will make the laws, the executive will enforce those laws, and the judiciary will adjudicate upon those laws. And if we didn't have separation of powers, we'd be at risk of having tyrannical leadership which creates laws that are conducive to them, enforce those laws in a way that they want, and interpret the laws in a way that is favorable to them. Now here's where things get interesting. Along with this idea of separation of powers exists this idea of checks and balances. It's like having siblings watching over each other to make sure that no one eats all the cookies. For instance, the judiciary keeps an eye on the legislature, making sure that they are not abusing their power by making inappropriate laws. And at the same time, in many countries, the Prime Minister and the ministers who are part of the executive are answerable to the parliament. So this ensures that no branch of government has too much control and power, and it also ensures that each branch of government acts as a check on the other. So then the final question is, do all the countries split up their powers in the same way? And the simple answer is no. Some countries strive to have a more stricter or perfect separation of powers. A good example is the United States of America, where their constitution very clearly tries to create a complete or at least near complete separation, whereas countries like the United Kingdom have a more weaker or fused separation of powers. So every country has a different degree of separation of powers depending on how it's incorporated into that country's constitution. Anyway, that's it for this episode. Basically, separation of powers is the backbone of our modern democracies. It ensures that one branch of government does not have too much power, therefore ensuring that our rights and liberties are protected, and also ensures that each branch of government acts as a check and a balance on the other branches of government. If you enjoyed this video, do consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more episodes like this. I'll see you in another episode. Take care. Bye.